rabbis. And the whole premise, if you remember, is to explain why the first century was such a contentious time. And some people would say, who cares about the first century, right? Like, who in the world would care about what was going on in Jerusalem in the first century or Israel in the first century? Well, anybody who reads the New Testament or the Bible, that's a lot of people. And what has emerged has been a very negative view of the rabbis because people miss the nuance and the historical, religious, social upheaval that was going on in that first century. So if you were here, we did the dynamics. We talked about all the different rulers who were in charge of Israel at the time and all the problems it brought. You know, the Romans would have statues and idols, and it just made a mess of things. But even before the Romans, we had various cultures. We realized that the rabbis in the first century were trying to navigate all the gaps the Bible leaves when you're trying to fulfill the commandments. Some of them are how exactly, okay, we're not supposed to be involved in idolatry. How far do we let it invade our culture and our daily life? How do we put fences up? How do we deal with issues of purity, right? We're dealing with pagans. How do we deal with purity? Like, what's a method of like remediating impurity? And then Torah learning. If you're going to have invasive cultures around you, you're going to need cultural norms and standards and teaching to protect and buttress your culture from that. Or you'll, as we talked about, you'll have a culture that disappears into the mass. It'll just boil into the surrounding culture. We looked at a couple examples of these where it seems like in the Gospels, it's a very simple question. Do we pay taxes to Caesar? And a lot of people look at that as a very brilliant answer on Jesus' Yeshua's part. But we realize behind that question is actually a very deep Jewish law question. How do we actually pay taxes to Caesar here? It wasn't worked out. The Torah doesn't exactly tell you yes or no. The rabbis are trying to figure this stuff out. And then tithing. We looked at another contextual example of one of Yeshua's statements about tithing. Well, that was an actual issue in that time. All of this contributes, these arguments, these tests, they all contribute to this very negative view of the Pharisees and Judaism. And it actually has a deep role in anti-Semitism. You'll see people say, oh, the Pharisees are still at it today. Or right, you see this very negative anti-Semitic thread that comes out of misreading the New Testament. Any questions from last week before we jump in? Because we're going to go a little bit deeper. Any questions emerge? Go ahead.
So I think it'd be also helpful to identify like the time frame in which someone could actually get a hold of the Talmud in their native tongue, outside of being inside of the Jewish world, and that basically, like, for all intents and purposes, humanity was shut out from it until like 1800s, 1900s at the earliest.
Yep.
And then, like, German was done, and then like English this 1950s and such like. So people haven't even really had the opportunity to read these texts in their native tongue until like this past century.
Yeah, so David brought up a good point, is that and I'll go into the details of this. Last week we did the high pass, the 10,000 foot view of the timeline. Judaism kind of collapsed inward to figure out its problems and navigate exile in all these places where they were being kicked out or persecuted. These writings weren't really available until very, very late in the game. And thankfully, we live in a time where you can actually open the Talmud, you can open the Midrash. If you remember a couple years ago, we did a multi-series layout of how much Midrash, Jewish tradition, is in the Gospels, and just week after week of that. I think it's pretty eye-opening. Same with this, but now we're actually able to open those up. Sefaria.org is a site you can go to if you don't have a Talmud like we have on our shelf. Most people don't. It's very expensive. You can go to Sefaria.org and you can read these things on your own. But we're going to go back. We're going to go back to just before. Go ahead, Josh.
Just want to point out that the Steinsaltz version is now free on TorahText.com.
Okay, so the Steinsaltz Talmud is now free on TorahText.com?
Yep.
Thank you. I didn't know that. Yeah, very good. So we're going to go back. Like I said, last week we looked at the categories of problems that the Jewish people had leading into the first century. Now I want to zoom in a little bit. Who's familiar with Hillel and Shammai? Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Shammai, right hands. We know that these are two actually different schools of Pharisees. And this is kind of like a 101 level idea that, hey, wait, the Pharisees weren't one unified body? No. We talked about that a little bit last week. You'll find all throughout, and we'll talk about some examples, Yeshua actually agreed with one school of Pharisaic thought or a different school. There was no apostasy from the Jewish expression of his time. He was in the weeds with people, discussing, debating at the time what was becoming a very contentious period. But Hillel and Shammai did actually a great job up until the point where they passed away. They did lead the Jewish people, not perfectly. There are still some things we're always going to have to figure out, but they did a good job of modeling, as it says in Pirkei Avot, arguments for the sake of heaven. These were the last two of a period called the Zugot, where you have two leaders who are more or less in charge of the Sanhedrin. Hillel was the president, and Shammai was the head of the court, Av Beit Din. And they would get together and they would discuss the problems of their day, and all these little courts would have problems, and they would get passed up to greater Sanhedrins all the way up to the great Sanhedrin. And Hillel tends to be looked at as the more lenient. I think leniency, I've always said this, I kind of harp on this, it's not always the best way to look at it, lenient versus strict. There are times Hillel is more strict, but that's just another thing we'll talk about in the future. But Hillel did have humility and patience. There are all these stories of people messing with him. One guy tried to anger him and just keeps firing questions at him, and he just very humbly answers all the questions. Whereas Shammai is more of a, don't have really the space for this. We need to go higher and higher. I'm going to hold people to a higher standard. That's also not wrong, but that's not very approachable for where most people are, right? I will say this. If you are in a synagogue, if you go to a synagogue anywhere and you're not Jewish, it's because of Rabbi Hillel that there is even a precedent for Gentiles to be a part of the synagogue. He was opening the door to the world to learn about the Torah. Again, that's in Pirkei Avot. Shammai had more of a position of, we just need to take the best of the best and go as high as we can with our observance. Does it make sense? So the idea of immersing a Gentile, allowing conversions, bringing people into some kind of a Torah context, that's Rabbi Hillel in the generation before the Apostolic era, before Yeshua. So there's possible overlap with some of these teachers, with some of our, what would you call them, our Apostolic writers. For sure, they would have been influenced by their teachings either on one side or the other. As I said, and Drake did a teaching on this, I mentioned it last week, in the idea of marriage, it's famously known that Yeshua actually sides with Shammai when Yeshua says, don't go near the towns of the Gentiles. Right, his interaction with Gentiles are kind of incidental. That was more likely the side of Shammai at that time. But later we see the ideas of Hillel coming through Paul. We see them coming through the other leadership in the apostolic world. They're taking more of a Hillel approach. So these two are very influential in the apostolic writings. Here's the timeline. Bear with me. I'm going to go into this later and kind of hit the key points. But I want you to see 0 to 30. 30 is about when Yeshua's mission starts, right? We don't know a lot about this, but we can say there was some overlap here with his life and these two teachers, at least when they were both together in their positions leading the people. Now, Hillel dies around 10 CE. Shammai dies around 30. So in this point of time here, you have the students of Hillel now interacting with the students of Shammai and Shammai. It's an imbalance. We no longer have this structure of two leaders. We now have a bit of an imbalance, right? One side has their leader, the other doesn't. It's the students. And we can see that these arguments start to increase. The Talmud kind of says it's beginning a terrible time. That only gets worse when Shammai dies. Now you have the students of Hillel and the students of Shammai arguing. And as is the case with the next generation from great teachers, they might not be up to the same standard as their teachers. It's natural. And the Torah became like two Torahs, the Talmud says. This group permits something, and this one forbids it. Well, that's not a matter of opinion. Now we're talking about everyday practice. Can we do this without violating the Torah, or can't we? Right? So you start to see this problem emerge. And if you look at the timing of this, it's possible Shammai died a little bit earlier here, but generally speaking, call it 30. By 30, he's no longer around. That's when this mission starts. So the New Testament is really known by these 3 years and the interactions of Paul. that is probably the most contentious time of that first century that we were looking at last year. In their time, they led the people together well. They only had 3 disagreements between each other, but they still modeled how to disagree with respect and care for the sake of heaven, right? The idea of a machloket in rabbinic tradition, an argument, it means to make smooth. And we said this before. You lay down 2 boards on a floor, and one has a little bit of a lip to it. A machloket is to make smooth, make an easy pass. It's a compromise. It's not arguing to crush your opponent and to win, right? It's an argument to make something more palatable and simple for people to then put into play. Do we pay taxes to Caesar or not, right? That's an example. Their teachings absolutely shaped the worldview of the New Testament, and if you are familiar with their arguments and the arguments of their students, this is where you'll see some examples in a moment. It's all throughout the New Testament. The arguments between Paul and certain Pharisees or Judeans in his letters are actually downstream from the arguments that came after these 2 were no longer in Israel. It grounds them. It puts a context behind them. Now you see this isn't simply, do we follow the traditions of men or Judaism or whatever. However the church has looked at that over time, has been without the nuance of understanding the problem, the time, the actual Jewish question, the legal Jewish question behind the easy question. And of course, when you do that, you stack up error upon error, and you come to your own conclusions. Right, and we talked about that. Okay, so Hillel dies, Shammai dies. It's kind of heading off the rails here. School of Hillel and School of Shammai, the Talmud more or less scolds them because they had not held to the same level of argument for the sake of heaven as their teachers did. They got some things wrong, and it really went off the rails somewhere in here when the Zealots started joining the School of Shammai. And I'll talk about that in a second here. That's when it goes wrong. Who's going to argue when you have Zealots on the other side? Who's going to win that argument, right? One of the biggest things that Hillel and Shammai argued, and I don't know if we have this on video, we did mention it, is this idea called the 18 measures. I put this red box because it came somewhere in here. Most people agree it came somewhere after Hillel died. Some people say he was alive. Doesn't matter. 18 measures are the 18 restrictions of how do we deal with these Roman pagans. Remember, Gentiles in this time were not Christians. They weren't going to a church. They weren't monotheists. They were pagans. We talked about how bad that was. And Shammai had a very distant, both hands shoving away all that they bring to the table. Let's just avoid being around them. We don't buy their oil. We don't buy their wine. We don't, right? 18 measures of things you don't do. Basically separating your society from their society. Hillel's group, from the way I understand it and the way some understand it, didn't agree with that approach. There's not really an on-ramp to get people under the wings of Torah. Where do we start? But who do you think won this out? Look at the time period. Who do you think won that argument? Right? And in the Jewish world, this is seen as a very, unfortunately, it's still somewhat out there until there's a great Sanhedrin again to like annul it. But the reality is, it's seen as a negative. That's not how the arguments are supposed to go. It's a very deep topic. Look up the 18 measures or the 18 edicts, and you'll understand why there was a problem, why it wasn't simple just bringing these Gentile pagans into the Jewish community. You'll see it's a very big problem. There was no precedent. The Torah doesn't exactly tell you how to do it, right? There's really no explanation of what that looks like day to day, right? So the Jewish tradition didn't have this under its feet yet. So this was a big point of contention. Obviously, this is a major point of contention in Paul's world and in the Apostolic community. Acts 15 is just downstream from that same question. What do we do? Do we convert them? Conversion was like the available path. Seems simple enough. We know what to do when they're Jews. What do we do if they're not Jews? How do we put some fences around them? What can we do? They're Roman citizens, right? How far can we go? All of that, I just show you this because as New Testament readers, this is absolutely critical to know. But if you are one who doesn't really read the New Testament, just know that after this, the school of Hillel was reestablished after the temple was destroyed. This is the Judaism that went forward. This is the Judaism that the world judges. Do you see the problem? And I showed you that graph last year. It was a tiny little speck of time in the whole arch. How much of a window the rabbis, whatever, the Pharisees are judged by that tiny window. This era is gone, long gone. This is what moved forward. And you'll see, when you read the Talmud and you read the Midrash, there are so many things that are in the New Testament that are in this era moving forward. It's verbatim in some cases. They're actually teaching the same things. They're pulling from the same well of tradition. What do we do with that, right? Any questions before I move on? And of course, if you're not familiar with the timeline from last week, 70 is when the temple was destroyed, and it began a process of exiles and persecutions, and it goes into the 130s, and it just continues under the Hadrianic era. But 70 is when it really started to come apart. Okay. So the resolution was this. Okay, Josh.
I think it's worth mentioning, just kind of goes into what you're saying. I was just listening to someone that had dug into this history, but apparently the Essenes, and not just the Essenes, but the Targums themselves, before the temple was actually destroyed, the language of being the temple and operating, not necessarily going to the temple, was starting to develop already. So that language that you're talking about in the New Testament is very much in Targums, and that was before temple actually was destroyed. So it was, just to put that in place, like that was starting to develop already.
I'm glad you brought that up, because the idea of, so what Josh is saying is, before the temple was even destroyed, they were already making the leap from hard, physical, actual Torah command. Here's the spiritual way of keeping that same Torah command. It's not one or the other. It's adding a level of spiritual insight into what you're doing on the physical level, if that makes sense. Don't just keep Shabbat and turn off your lights and sit in the dark, miserable, and right. What are you doing it for? Right? They were already getting into the spiritual reason behind all of the mitzvot. So thank you. Yeah. That obviously becomes more important after there is clearly no temple. Then how do you reunite the people when they don't have the temple, which is a great place to go. People enjoy that pilgrimage. So the resolution was this. The surviving sages, because remember, like last week, all those groups, there were 24 groups of Jewish expression that more or less faded into one group, or they were wiped out in some manner. We're talking probably millions of people, would you say, Peter, were wiped out in the Roman Jewish wars and then the Bar Kokhba wars. For about 3 years, the sages discussed the situation. They knew what the problem was already. Our sectarian arguments and the lack of concern and compassion for each other brought us here. Like, we're not dumb. We know what happened. Right? And the Talmud talks about that. We didn't love each other with compassion. We actually were arguing baseless hatred. We'll talk about these in a few weeks with the Tisha B'Av, the temple's destruction. They determined that the school of Hillel, okay, so we have some people from Shammai and we have some people from Hillel. In this discussion, they realized both were technically right. There are times Hillel is right, and there are times Shammai is right. And there are times they actually agree with each other. But one is better for now, and one's better for the future. Which is the best for exile? Because guess what? We're heading into exile. Temple's gone. We're not allowed to go back. We're not even trying to go back because it's completely off limits now, historically. Hillel embodied a more appropriate, compassionate, open-door policy to get people on board and just kind of pull everyone back together through some kind of a unifying worldview. Judaism had said at this point, denominations no longer work for us. We have to come up with a new strategy.
No, I mean, I guess you can't highlight enough or underscore enough how much of a cataclysm I think the destruction of the temple was. That at Yavna, whatever was said at Yavna, they would have to have some kind of convention afterwards, after Titus and Vespasian destroyed the temple and sacked Jerusalem. They essentially didn't have a nation anymore at that point. And so it's like, well, how do we persist, and how do we build a lifeboat so to speak, out of this big vessel of state that's sunk? How do we build a lifeboat and get everybody on it in sort of a working order? We don't have the central cultic life of the temple. We don't have Jerusalem anymore. It's not really ours, not
Yeah.
really. And we don't have statehood. And so how do we replace that maybe with prayer and academics and those types of things?
Beautiful. And so I think we will talk about this. I know Rabbi Peter's talking about doing a Tish B'Av teaching about the temple and the importance of it. We wouldn't have a Torah scroll. If this generation had given up and walked away and said, you know what, the Romans, they defeated us, we're finished. We wouldn't have a Torah. We wouldn't have a Bible, right? These things would not have made it. The church wouldn't exist for quite a while later. The New Testament wasn't compiled until, 367? Like nearly 370? That's pretty far down the road. I think the world would look very different. Those biblical values would not have been carried forward. The world would be very different. Now, does anyone know why, when you have groups of both, why isn't Shammai's opinion the one we go forward with? How did we decide that Hillel is the one? Good. Okay, impractical.
I mean, on a shot level, it's highly impractical.
Highly impractical, hard for people to actually pull off. Right?
It's a hard one.
Yeah. There's another reason. This new era had to be built on unity. We don't argue to that degree anymore. We don't argue and forget that we're talking with people and brothers and sisters. We have to inject compassion, so no more arguments that cause division. And in fact, there are still some in the Talmud. You see it, this first generation of trying to put the pieces back together. Some people want to revert back to arguing. It doesn't go well. There's a whole emphasis on squashing divisive arguments from that point forward. But Hillel, the Talmud says in Eruvin 13b, Hillel won out because they were agreeable. They showed restraint. They caved at times. They studied the opinions of the other school. And they even, when coming up with their own rationale, would study that opinion and share it first so that they can then give their side. Who gives both sides of a story before, right? Like people tend to lean or put a spin on something. They studied both sides of an argument. And this tradition is actually part of the yeshiva. So you'll hear in like Jerusalem, there'll be a yeshiva. They'll have two students. And you argue this point and you argue this one. And they passionately study and they argue it. Now switch. You passionately argue against what you just argued for. And you know what they do? They learn both sides of the story. It becomes real for them. That's a Hillel value. That's not what you see in the first century in the window of the Gospels. You're seeing these things are being worked out, but in a very sectarian time of argument. Does it make sense? So Hillel won precisely because they have the methodology. It's going to prevent that sectarianism from ever really rearing its head. And I will say this about the Talmud. So this is a little bonus content. People will go into the Talmud and they will take an argument and say, look what the rabbis believe about this. The argument is left there because they want you to see the whole thought process. They want you to see both sides of it. They're not telling you, and in some cases they will, we don't go by that person's opinion. But here's what their opinion was. Think back to this. Hillel, they give both sides of it. They want you to see the whole argument. So if somebody goes in and picks the wrong side of it and doesn't read anything else, and they extract that sentence and they put it on TikTok and they say, the Jews believe this, it's possibly out of context. And if you're familiar with it, you can say, oh, who said that? I can tell you why that's wrong. You didn't read the full paragraph. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, and a lot of people do that with the New Testament too. Like, this is what the Jews, all the Jews, every single one, all of them, how they were and what they believed.
Yeah, for sure. And it's kind of a modern thing, right? We don't do genuine, deep research on both sides of a story. We just go with the one we like, and unfortunately, that's a very destructive, divisive way to go.
Well, I mean, like if you read the Wall Street Journal, for example, right? The Wall Street Journal might not really much have an opinion on something, but it has multiple contributors, ranging from, on the left you'd have Robert Reich, and on the right you'd have like Milton Friedman. And so you take an excerpt from one contributor out of hundreds, and say, this is what the Wall Street Journal believes.
Yeah.
No, that's one voice from one contributor that was included in there for the sake of transparency, and you're decontextualizing it and blanketing everything.
Yeah, just a general rule for all of us, if you engage in the rabbinic literature, even now in just the Gospels, I don't necessarily think everyone should just go headlong into the Talmud. It's a very challenging volume because you're reading a lot of different material in a very different psyche. But what I would say is, if it doesn't make sense to you, investigate that. Look deeper. What's behind that question? Even in everywhere else in life, use that methodology. Try to seek to understand the other side. Don't just think the translated version that you're reading is all there is to the story. We're going to find this out. I'm going to move forward. But I want you to know that the new method going forward after the temple destruction is very different than what the snapshot of the New Testament is. So if someone is judging what the rabbis or the Pharisees believe based on what they're reading in the Gospels, guess what? You have really old data. Thousands of year old data that doesn't actually equate anymore. Oh, and by the way, if you decided you were a diehard Shammai, you could do that. You can continue with that. That's not a problem. But just know that if you end up putting yourself in a leadership position, you can't, require everyone to hold the same level of observance you do. You just have to know that you can do that if you want. You can take the most strict approach. But when someone asks you a question, you can't just tell them what you do. Right? There's a whole process behind that. Okay, so here we're going to go into some examples. And I want to try to put some dates behind them where possible. And this is just a handful, because I could really go on for hours on this. Matthew 7, say whatever you wish to others that you would want them to do. Oh, wait, really weird translation. Do unto others what you would want them to do to you, right? Okay, so this comes back to Hillel. That which is hateful to you, don't do to another. So the golden rule of Jesus is actually a Hillel quote with a little bit of a spin. Anyone knew that? I'm sure some people knew that, right? Like, this famous golden rule is actually Beit Hillel, the school of Hillel, and probably from Hillel himself. Another one. Yeshua sits with tax collectors and sinners, and some Pharisees saw this and say, why do your disciples eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now, which school of Pharisees do you think might have asked the question? Shammai. Why? Because they had they wanted to kind of weed out those who weren't on a higher level. Hillel says, be like the disciples of Aaron, loving peace, pursuing peace, loving people, and drawing them near to Torah. So Hillel's stance is, let's get everybody, and you'll see this in his interactions with people. He wants to bring people in. And we see this by the next generation. Rabbi Meir is in this situation, and these hooligans are giving him a hard time every day. And he talks to his wife. She's a brilliant persona in the Talmud. He says, I can't stand these people. I'm going to pray that God just wipes them out. I'm tired of these people. And his wife says, why don't you just pray that they repent? Instead of getting rid of the sinners, just get rid of the sin in the people. He's like, I didn't think of that. So right? His wife delivers it with nuance, and actually that happens. He finds a way to work with them, and he causes them to repent, and then they become great people. Good.
Well, in a modern day spin of that, the Breslov teaching is that in the slide before, the very thing that you hate in someone is actually something that's found in you, and that's why you hate it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing would be, instead of trying to change the world, change you, and the world will change for you. So I think we see that in a modern in Breslov, or in I can't think of the word now, my brain is something like
Hasidic movement.
Hasidic movement. So he looked inside of himself and changed the way he approached it, and then it changed for him.
And that's going to become an ethic as Jewish thought continues to evolve and expand. You're going to see more of a move into the spiritual behind what's going on. Not negating the other, but adding to it. There's something spiritual going on behind this. Or you might even see, like by the time you get to the Hasidic movement, it's psychological now, like emotional. Did I see a hand?
Yes. Going back to the screen before, that exact quote, which you would know this, you would tell it better than me, but the Gentile who wanted to learn Torah while standing on one foot and went to Shammai, and Shammai thought it was ridiculous and kicked him out, and then he went to Hillel, the Gentile wanted to learn Torah on one foot, and Hillel said the exact same quote, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, the rest is the explanation of this, go and study it.
Yep.
So that shows a difference too between the Gevurah of Shammai and the Chesed of Hillel in their judgment and mercy.
Yeah, that's a really good point Sandy brought up. There are many stories of this to basically show the difference of opinion and how we should act. Like Hillel, where someone comes to you, in this case a Gentile comes to him and says, I want to learn the Torah quickly. I don't have a lot of time. I need to know what this is all about. And I think I have that quote coming up. Shammai has no interest in that type of a parameter. I don't have time for that. You're going to dedicate your life to this. We're not going to do this in 30 seconds. Hillel gives them a place to start, right? Now, who's right, who's wrong? Depends on what the situation is. Okay, so one group worked with sinners and was more inclusive of people who were curious. One group just wasn't. They were not focused on that, right? Now, that seems weird to us today, but we have to remember in this time, this was not mapped out. The Torah does have commandments that seem pretty separatist from the cultures around you. How do you bring people in? It doesn't exactly say that. You have to figure that out. Another one, having little faith. So Yeshua is talking about, don't worry about where your food will come from tomorrow or your drink. Right, you have little faith, I think he goes on to say. Rabbi Eliezer, so 80 to 110, great sage. He says, whoever has bread in his basket to eat today and says, what shall I eat tomorrow, is of little faith. Now he's actually, I believe, from the school of Shammai. But even he was catching on, he understood these ideas, right? Same passage. I mean, it could even be closer when you boil them down to the same language, but you get the point. Forgiving others. Timely, because we're talking about Yom Kippur here. If you are offering a gift at the altar, the actual altar, not metaphoric, right? They're talking about the temple. And you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift before the altar and go. Be reconciled with your brother, and then afterwards, after you've settled that, then bring your gift, right? What good is giving gifts to the altar or whatever it is that you're doing there when you have a wreck of relationships on the horizontal level?
That's a very, systemic. I mean, sages have all, it's very clear. They say you repent to God for the things you've done to God, and you repent to the person that you do against the person. It's very specific. You don't just get to go to God and then it just magically makes it okay with the person.
Yeah.
That's not how it works.
Because you haven't reconciled with God. The people are just an interface for God in this regard, in this idea. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he was a young leader who was one of the people tagged to help reboot Judaism from Yavne. He says for transgressions between a person and God, Yom Kippur can atone for that. But a person and another, Yom Kippur doesn't atone for that. You have to do that. Right? It's the same thing. Get back, do the hard things. Go repent. Go make good with the arguments with people. You can't just come to God and ignore those. You have to do the difficult things. Same idea. And there's more. There's a lot of this same language, but you get the idea, right? You will see at times the idea, better to cut off your right hand and throw it away rather than descend into Gehenna. The rabbis make statements like this. I think it was Origen. Was it Origen who took these literally? One of the church fathers took... I don't know who it is. I should have looked it up. Some people may have taken this very literally. I don't think it solved the problem. Anyway, but you will see the rabbis in very similar situations. Though in one case, they're talking about things you do with the body. It'd be better you get rid of that than descend into the pit of destruction. These are rabbinic euphemisms. And Yeshua's not the only one to make those statements, right? When you pray, don't heap up empty phrases, as the Gentiles, will call them pagans, do. They think they'll be heard for their many words. And then, like on the other side, you have people who, these are some of the religious Jewish leaders. I have two in here because I want to equal opportunity, this one. You can also be religious and make long prayers that are useless. So not really doing anything in them. Rabbi Yochanan Anyone who prolongs his prayer and expects it to be answered will ultimately come to heartache. Right? It's the same idea. Because these are human problems they're dealing with. So do you see the parallels? Right? These are virtually the same teachings. So we have a problem if all the stuff that the rabbis write are wrong and evil or whatever, however far you're going to go with that. What happens when they're saying the same thing? What do you do with that? Another one, committing adultery with the eyes. Of course, Matthew 5:28, the person who looks at another woman with intent has committed adultery. Rav Sheshet says it a little bit more nuanced. Anyone who looks at a woman's little finger, I guess he's, I assume there's some kind of a demarcation or a ring or something that would indicate this person's married or not. It's as if you gazed upon her nakedness, for your intentions are impure. Right? We still have the same idea in here. Again, this tractate Baruch. He who makes so this is one where God does things for good and bad people. God blesses everybody. It's kind of a paradox. Why does he do that? Evil and the good, the sun rises on the evil and the good, and sends the rain on the just and the unjust. And we see a discussion about this in Ta'anit 7 of Rabbi Abahu. The rain benefits both the righteous and the wicked. It's kind of the same idea. There's a discussion about this. The rabbis are saying, why doesn't he punish these people already? Right? Why is he blessing them and their fields are fertile? That's how God works, according to Yeshua and according to the rabbis. Okay, it's a different one. 2 sparrows sold for a penny, or not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father, but even the hairs on your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore you're more value than sparrows. And over here, Mishnah, actually around the year 100, 150, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, have you ever seen a beast or a bird that has a job or a trade? Yet they earn their livelihood without anguish. But all these were created to serve humans, and I, a human, was created to serve the one who formed me. Right? So it's this idea that they're comparing nature. Hey, look, the bird, and this is something that I do. Whenever the world gets a little heavy or things are chaotic and you don't really know where we're headed, go outside. Not a single bird cares about what's going on in the world, right? Like, they don't care. So they had the same context. They would look around and say, things are really heavy. Why are we worrying? These animals aren't worrying, right? And these are lower on the creation scale. Why are we worried? Don't we have Emunah? Okay, any questions on those? Anyone, do you get the point? Right, and there's so many of them. I just picked a handful, and I honestly have more that I just buried in the slides because it would make no sense to we would be here all day. So I want to go deeper onto the healing on Shabbat. And before I do, I want to source a question. Wrong answers only.
Oh, no. I've got lots.
What do the Pharisees, what do the rabbis believe about healing on Shabbat? Yeah, David.
Helping people is bad.
Helping people is bad.
You said wrong answers only.
Yeah. Good, right? Any other?
Healing is work. I mean, that's what I always got from it, was if you can't heal on Shabbat, then that's equating healing to work. And that kind of confused.
Right, and what's the conclusion? If healing is work,
Follow rules rather than be healed.
right, or you just abandon this entire system. This entire system is flawed. Jesus is clearly saying this system is wrong. And in fact, I didn't, for the sake of time, add this, but I have sources of popular evangelical sites that come to that conclusion. Shabbat is for mankind, but you can't heal people on Shabbat, so therefore we're going to redefine what Shabbat is, make it whatever we want it to be, move it wherever we want it to go, and as long as we save people, we're good, right? So there's these really strange acrobatics that get us to this place where basically we walk away from the Torah. And then you go into, I didn't come to abolish the Torah, and somehow that equates support for this, or the hand washing in Mark 7, we don't wash hands, the traditions of man, and that supports it. You can see how these are piled together.
Well, I think oftentimes in popular lexicon, to fulfill means to abolish in a nice, respectful way.
Right.
Like on the up and up.
Same conclusion.
We're just giving it an old retirement watch and sending it out to pasture in a very gentle, but it's still turning it into nothing.
Yeah.
So.
Josh.
I was just talking to somebody recently, and their whole thing was that the only reason we were given a law was to keep our hearts tender for when the Messiah comes. So that was the whole purpose for their words, the law, the Torah.
Yeah, it becomes very ethereal and like squishy.
Yeah, what Drake, you said, fulfill into irrelevance.
Yeah.
We get the impression, though, in like all seriousness, we get the impression that Shabbat is something of the past. Yeshua did away with it. He made a statement, "I'm the Lord of Shabbat," and that apparently equates to, oh good, we don't have to worry about that anymore. We move on, right? And we talked about this. The apostles didn't get that conclusion because they continued. Paul didn't get that conclusion because he, basically his career, the rest of his life was in the synagogue teaching. Okay, so what if there was more going on in that argument that we missed? What if there was a deeper assumption, a foundation, or even a framework operative at that time, and everything is built on top of our awareness of that foundation already, right? Okay, overview. There are 39 categories of activities forbidden on Shabbat. The sages, even back to the time of Hillel, it seemed like a lot of these were understood. There are times when Moses didn't quite understand exactly, is that a violation? And he'd go to God and find out, oh yes, that was a violation, and they have to like update. Well, they passed these down over time, and it turns out 39 of the activities that go into building the temple, essentially, are things that are forbidden on Shabbat. Okay, you can see them more or less found in Exodus 31 and 35. On top of that, healing is prohibited, but not because of healing, not because somebody needs to be healed, but because of the category of grinding. You're grinding things, you're a physician, and you want to mash herbs and things together, and oils. That's what is actually being scrutinized. The activity of creating, grinding something. Go ahead, Josh.
So the 39 categories are essentially activities that Hashem was doing during creation. That anything that was going on during creation we can't do.
Yeah, I like that. Sounds like a midrash.
Maybe that's...
I think that the idea of work is actually not the best translation for malacha, when it comes to creation. It's actually creation itself. So like if you light a candle, you're essentially creating heat and light. It's not like a priest can work in a temple, or a rabbi can work, do his profession in the synagogue on Shabbat, but he's not creating.
Yeah, actually in the temple they were able to do things that were forbidden. They lit candles, they lit menorah, I mean, they did.
For sure. And Yeshua calls that out. Right? He even talks about that in one of his rebuttals. He mentions that the priests aren't violating and they're doing God's work. Okay, so, but for everybody else, where do you start? Right? Where do you begin? Healing is not a category that's forbidden. Grinding is a category that's forbidden. And under grinding, all the different types, healing tends to happen from a doctor who might try to use Shabbat to build up all their materials for the week. Right? You can see how someone might use that. While I'm sitting here, I might as well just prepare for the week. Right? Not supposed to do that. Okay, so the discussion is actually more about what types of healing a physician can employ. It's not about the person. Like, someone's not laying on the floor writhing in pain and they're all talking about, like, can we do this? It's somewhat of a theoretical. But in general, Judaism permits almost all categories of healing, and has. With the exception of that little window of time, it seemed as if the school of Shammai, I'll come back to this in a second, the school of Shammai, when I'm reading, I think it's Tractate Yoma, Shammai has a hard time figuring out what to do on a certain holiday. It might have been Tractate. It might have been Yom Kippur. Makes sense. He gets to a point where he has to feed his kids, but he realizes to do that, he might violate some other aspect of Yom Kippur. Again, it's not spelled out. So he and Hillel made a provision that allowed them to do certain things without violating, because saving a life, feeding your kids, health and wellness takes precedence. So Judaism at the time already had categories of healing that were permitted. If it's life-threatening, absolutely. Crash the Shabbat out and heal that person. No question. And I'll show you some verses in a second. If it's serious but not life-threatening, if there's even a doubt, heal that person. If it's a minor illness, headaches, discomfort, yeah, there are ways you can heal them. But if you have any doubt that this could be something or could lead to something, it escalates, and you, right? So we're talking out of these, call them 4 categories. They're all permitted. These are all permitted. So what are we talking about? The rabbis don't allow healing. They do allow healing.
You guys have a question. I'm not trying to be real. I hope I'm not. But why was it so focused on the healing when he told him to get up and carry his bed, which is actually a violation? Because that's not mentioned, but carrying.
Oh yeah, talking about the Eruv.
Well, I mean, do they even have her? My question, though, they didn't even mention the fact that he was carrying. That is a violation of Shabbat.
Yeah, there's debate on whether where the Eruv originated. It doesn't seem like we have a lot of writings from that time period, but there's an argument that some of these were already in play. And Eruv, by the way, I'm sorry, if you go to Jerusalem or you go to an Orthodox Jewish community, there's a line, some kind of a boundary line that you can carry things from building to building. You can carry food to your friend's house. You can carry a bag. You can carry your siddur, whatever, on Shabbat. Jerusalem has one of the biggest in the world. You can go almost anywhere in Jerusalem and you're not breaking the Eruv. Some people don't actually hold to it. Some, like ultra-Orthodox, see it as a rabbinic innovation that they don't buy into. You can do that. You can have your own beliefs about these things. You can hold your own beliefs within that parameter. The argument is healing wasn't a problem, but Yeshua telling him to pick up his mat and carry it was a problem. It really just comes down to like that argument of when the Eruv was established. It might have been. Some of these things seem like they were on and off at a time. I don't know that we have enough information. And a rabbi I used to learn under early on said when there's an argument, it's usually a sign in this context that there isn't enough information. So I take the opinion that maybe it came later. Or maybe it was in play, but it wasn't universalized until later. Did you have a question?
I was just wondering how he got his mat there in the first place. So like there is carrying involved, it would seem, in that space, and so he brought it with him as part of like his healing, part of like his comfort. Now to take it back home, well, I'm done with that. Like you know, I think there's a dimensionality to like the extent that like you are getting rid of something. There's also a cleaning up process associated with it, and so it completes the healing.
Yeah, it's worth study. It would be one of the only that is one of the ultra-Orthodox people look at or Orthodox people who are free enough to look at the New Testament. That is one that they look at, or the grazing in the field, because there are rules on Shabbat. It's a good point, for sure. We can talk about it.
It seems to me that while there had the arguments, Shammai, what's the rule, the carrying, the healing, the grinding, a lot of it came from a place where they wanted to nitpick the healing as more of a reason where the crowd should not believe that he is the Messiah. So it was just a very scrutinized version. Like he's accused of casting out demons by Beelzebub. So that's just what it tells me. It just tells me that those were just excuses to valid arguments, but they were pointing that out as more of a, here, we'll prove to you that this cannot be the Messiah. The healing is not from God. This is not a prophet. This is somebody that's breaking all these little arguments that we have between us. But the main reason was just to diminish.
Yeah, for sure. There's always that, right? Then you have like Nicodemus says, "Hey, we know. Who's we? He's on the Sanhedrin, most likely. We know you're a person of God." So you have all of these. There is no one view, right? We have many views, and you probably have your people. You do see this in the Talmud. Some of the students of Shammai were real sticklers, and maybe these are theoretical, but you didn't think about this. Oh yeah, well you didn't think about it. Maybe there's a little bit of one-upping in that. They call it like pilpul, that discussion type of. Not everything's a test. Sometimes they're just flexing their knowledge, right? Could be anything. There's a whole bunch of these reasons. Go ahead, Anthony.
I know that your teaching is on the arguments with the rabbis in modern day, I guess, Christianity in a sense. somehow it seems like we've missed the understanding of Yeshua's healings. As I did the study for the men, 70% of his healings are spoken, not physical. So there's no actual work being done except for creation. God spoke. And then he also says that your sins are forgiven. So we're not looking at the concept of that these people have suffered their due punishment, I guess you might say. I don't want to call it, that's probably not the best word, but the spiritual that's come about. And then Yeshua's really saying, hey, you served your time, you're forgiven, you're not taking this into the world to come. Like you're forgiven here. Your sin has been forgiven by your suffering, and that you've been forgiven, and that you're healed. And somehow, I don't know, in the writings or our discussion throughout the years of Christianity, we're arguing about something, and we're missing the point of spiritual salvation, not salvation like Christianity and for that. But I'm just saying, in Judaism, salvation is here, and we receive the world to come.
Yeah, it's a great point, and that's where we're headed. There's a different meaning behind these healing stories. Otherwise, they wouldn't really be of any value. There's a deeper meaning.
Rabbi Peter's been trying to get your
Oh,
attention.
sorry. I'm like,
Yeah.
The Bethesda healing is a really complicated passage. It really needs to be studied on its own. There's actually a lot packed into there. The carrying your bed is done for a reason. There's a very, very specific reason why he tells them to pick up his bed. And a lot of the teachings, a lot of the healings are actually what I call authority challenges, where Yeshua basically says, okay, you don't want to believe in me? How about I just tell this person, get up and walk? Can you do that? You still don't want to believe me? Okay, I'll go walk across the lake. And it's smearing the mud, for example, in a person's face. I'm going to spit in the dirt, smear it on your face, go wash it off, you're healed. That is basically saying, I'm going to make a pretend medicine that's going to heal you. And that is an authority challenge. It's like saying, I can do this.
yeah, absolutely.
And it becomes a point of like you basically forcing people, either you're going to admit that I have something you don't have, none of you do, or you just go away, you become irrelevant.
I see another thing in this. When he says to the man, pick up your bed and walk, he has to have faith to pick up the bed and then walk. And when he does that, everyone who sees him, who knew he couldn't walk, has seen this demonstration of testimony.
Yeah, this will be a teaching hour. This one will be. There's a lot. Some of them, even the mud. There's a lot of. It's not about the Peshat argument, the plain level. There's a lot being connected. Go ahead.
Just to resolve the potential breach, there's provision, I believe, if it's the only belongings to carry on Shabbat. If that's all you have and you require it to survive, you're allowed to carry. So I was more specifically asking, why didn't they ask him about that versus the healing itself? When one is a blatant, perceived breach, and one is not really one anyway, right?
My escape hatch to that is that the author is not concerned about that. The author is trying to make a bigger theological point, and that's what a lot of the arguments are really about. But it's built on a halakhic argument, but it's about a theological point.
I just forgot to say that Yeshua summed it up and said, it's hard for you guys to believe my words. And he pointed out and said, if you don't believe my words, believe the works.
Yeah.
So the works and the healings, part of the reason was for people to believe. And he said it clearly.
Yeah, so, and I'm going to come back to that. Don't let me lose that point. I do want to show you something, and we'll circle back because it'll make sense of that. Okay, Steinsaltz's commentary, which is what we have on the wall back there. He states, from the sages, one's health overrides Shabbat in any situation where a life might be in danger. Therefore, all manner of treatments are permitted. Right? That's more of a Hillel opinion, But I imagine some people in the school of Shammai also held that, but there probably were some people Yeshua was arguing with who were really challenged by what he was doing. But if you think, and so here's some other versions, saving a life overrides Shabbat, no problem. That's to create one Shabbat for the person so that they may keep many more. Right? It's just plain logic, right? Save them today, and they can keep many more, and that's a good thing.
So I think that second quote points to something that I believe is in play here, which is that sins kind of have a hierarchy, but that doesn't mean that they're not sins. That it may be important to commit a sin in order to avoid a greater sin, but you still have sinned, and that still needs to be, you still need to address that with God.
Yeah, there are times in life when you're not getting out of the conflict without some mud, right? And that's the nature of the rabbinic tradition, is to try to weigh those out and figure out weightier, right? We talked about that last week, the weightier matters. You do this, but you completely neglect this, right? Like, what's the priority here? Without some kind of a framework to rank these and understand what's going on spiritually, you either are going to have to create your own framework, or you're going to do what some have done and just, you know what, abandon it. Nobody can keep that. You just walk away from it with each generation. Later in the Shulchan Aruch, even the same thing, you know, just repeating this hundreds and hundreds, 1,000 years later, whether it's threatening or not, if you're in doubt, save the life. Do whatever you have to do to any extent. Keep that life, right? So here's the point. This is coming back to what the authors of the Gospels are really trying to teach, because they're not going to show you something unless there's some deeper reason behind it, but you have to know the foundation and understand why it's an argument at all. A lot of the healings, even though each one is a universe of ideas and theological messianic meanings to it, these are all people that could have waited until Sunday. It's the one category that the rabbinic tradition doesn't exactly allow. Now, if there's doubt, do what you have to do. But a man with a withered hand, he's had that all of his life. The woman with 18 years ailment, the man with dropsy, healing the paralytic. I mean, all of these, healing the man born blind. Every one of these, number one, they could have waited if anyone could heal them. And two, who even heals those? Who can even heal those? And that's back to Rabbi Peter's point. The argument is not about healing on Shabbat. It's making a messianic claim. So in the tradition, somebody sent by another, in the legal Jewish category, is called a shaliach. It's an apostle. Messiah is a shaliach of God. Prophets are sometimes a shaliach of God, giving a message on God's behalf. It usually doesn't go well, right? Because you're giving it to people who don't hear. That's just a biblical, that's like a biblical statement. Right? But what does he do? It's not me who says it, it's the one who sent me. There's that word again, sent, right? Shaliach means sent. His whole purpose of healing these things, which aren't even categories of healing. Be honest, like who would even waste time? Like they don't do that in the rabbinic tradition. They don't argue things that are not possible. Like, can we heal on Shabbat if it's healing somebody that's been blind all their life? Like, when is that going to happen, right? They're talking about practical healing. So it creates this tension. But the wrong conclusion is that the rabbis forbid healing and they'll just let somebody die because of Shabbat. That's not the conclusion. The conclusion is the authors are trying to show you something higher is going on. Hence we see this a couple times. Yeshua's plucking in the field, and he makes a big theological statement about the Son of Man and compares it to David eating the showbread. Right? That's not about plucking or bread. That's like something bigger is happening right now, and you guys aren't seeing it. That's the point. That's what the authors are trying to point to. But if you understand that most of the everyday healings are accepted, well, then the rabbis do accept healing. They do it all the time. But what's going on here on top of that is he's healing things that were never possible to be healed, and also they could have waited. If you want to sidestep the tension, just wait a couple hours. But the tension comes from that situation. And they're not mad that he's healing. If you remember, they're mad because something theological is going on and they're not really on board with it for one reason or another. You don't want to give credence to this, right? Otherwise, you don't try to destroy somebody because they're healing. Now, I saw your hand. One thing to think about, what does Rabban Gamliel say about the apostles when they get arrested later in the book of Acts? School of Hillel. Rabban Gamliel, I think, is the great-grandson of Hillel, by the way, who's Paul's teacher. If it's of God, don't get in the way of it. If it's not, God's going to take it out. Let it play itself out. So we can probably say the people he's arguing with are not from the school of Hillel. Just logically. They're probably the school of Shammai. They're missing the point. And again, doesn't really matter for the rest of the world because that was all resolved after 70 AD.
I want to say also that there's a dynamic of Pharisees or Sadducees or whoever that were also proselytes. You know, and everybody, it's an assumption that everybody's native born, but there was probably a lot of proselytes that were boasting in their new status as sons of Abraham when, you know, when John the Immerser said, you know, don't think that you're something because you're a son of Abraham. You can raise up sons of Abraham from the rock.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's yeah, that's a deep topic. Yeah, proselytes going native. Beth, you do.
Yeah, I just had a thought. I don't mean to be smart about it, but what about the person who just realized that there's healing potential and somebody's going to ask them to wait another day when they could be healed for the rest of their life? I bet none of those people would want to wait the extra day.
Yeah, and that would be a really boring story, though, wouldn't it, in the Gospels? It really wouldn't prove the point.
Okay.
Right?
I give.
I'm just playing the other side of it. But
Sorry.
like in reality, yeah, like I think most people would say, if you can heal them, I want to see this happen. Like, let's see it. But I think the Gospels are building a tension. Remember, it's a literary work. It's trying to build a tension between the people who don't get it and readers who do get it. Right? The reader is part of that narrative. You can't look at it and assume everything that we need to know is in the gospel writing. There's a lot of assumptive material behind it that we're just missing because we've not been told that there's stuff behind it. This is my last slide. And this captures the point I want to leave us with. So we covered the history. We know that the era of the New Testament is long gone. It's not coming back. Judaism's not going back to that kind of sectarianism again. They're going to do everything they can to protect it. So if we're still going by that model, we're way off. We have bad data. What the Torah is, though, it's more than the Word of God. This is Abraham Joshua Heschel. It's the Word of God and man, a record of both revelation and response. God gives us the Torah. Constantly, the world is changing. New situations are emerging. How we interact with the Torah, how we build fences, how we deploy it in our communities, that's also part of the equation, right? A dance is two people, not one. The Torah is that. And that's why the tradition continues to unroll new revelation and insight as we go, and continues to until Messiah is here.
I heard it said at a Shabbat conference that, in Messianic Judaism, there's a sense whereby adherents look back to the hallowed past and they try to sort of be time travelers, or nostalgically restore a sort of a bygone era that's already passed. And, I don't think we should do that. I mean, we have the Torah, we have Talmud, we have the sages, we have Yeshua, we have all that. It's like, well, you're going to have to tool it for the era that you're in. Whatever that chapter was at the time of the Second Temple period, it's already been tucked into the annals of history, and you have to build something for yourself now and for your kids now. And over-idealizing the past, or a certain narrow window of it, is probably just not the most helpful thing.
Yeah, I mean, even in the New Testament era, they had a temple. The world was very different.
Yeah.
Right? They were located in one general area. We're in a completely new... I mean, one person can have a blog that far outnumbers the amount of people the apostles reached in their time.
Yeah.
Right? Or a YouTube channel, or whatever. We're in a completely different world. So we need kind of an update. We need a kind of ongoing, rolling revelation But with that revelation is that response, how we take part in that. Which is what we do, right? We do that every week. This is what we're here for. Any questions? That's it for me on this one. Any last questions?